So you've watched the material on Reconstruction, and now you find yourself staring off into space, going, "Oh my gosh, what did I just watch?" Well, if that's you, you're in luck because what we're going to do in this discussion is maybe reconstruct your knowledge on Reconstruction. If you haven't watched those lectures, stop and watch those now because some of our discussion will kind of assume that you're familiar with things like the 14th Amendment, with things like what the Black Codes are, what Jim Crow laws are. This is just going to connect those pieces together. But again, it's also kind of a good review. And again, it helps sort of take what is very, very abstract and, make it come together. So the Civil War is relatively easy. It's, about fighting. It's about taking territory. It's about making the southern states cry uncle, making sure that they don't do it again, and ending slavery permanently. That's a little bit more difficult. And remember that even though the 13th Amendment is passed during the American Civil War, which legally abolishes slavery, the reality is that the 13th Amendment is only as useful as to the extent to which it can be enforced. So remember also that many Southerners, after the end of the American Civil War, and well after that time period, are not exactly happy about the 13th Amendment. And they instantly start doing things to kind of turn back the clock. You see at the state level laws called Black Codes that are passed. These are laws in which African Americans are openly discriminated against. They can't, for example, serve on juries. They can't work in professions that are outside of farming and agriculture. In other words, what happens is that at the state level, southern states try to basically force African Americans to be as much like slaves as possible without calling them slaves. Now, theoretically, that should be illegal, but at the same time, if you were to ask Andrew Johnson and some moderate Republicans and war Democrats or Union Democrats, they would say that the goal was to eliminate slavery, and just that. Anything else risks exacerbating this fundamental division between northern and southern states. But on the flip side, radical Republicans in Congress make the case that it's that division that got us here in the first place, these differences over how African Americans should be treated. And also just the fact that the North and the South have become fundamentally different societies. And we can see traces of that dating all the way back to colonization, but the fact is that the North, which was already pretty industrial before the Civil War, becomes incredibly industrialized afterwards. And of course, the South, to a certain extent, you see kind of a move in the other direction. The Civil War destroys a lot of manufacturing and industry in the South, and the South actually becomes even arguably more agrarian after the Civil War. So what happens, remember, is that immediately after the Civil War, there's this period called presidential Reconstruction, where President Johnson, coming into office after Lincoln's assassination, tries to steer this, very accommodating approach in which Southern states only have to make a few small changes in order to be brought back into the Union and given congressional congressional representation. Increasingly, congressional radical Republicans say that's not enough. That if you basically bring the South back in without demanding more substantive changes, then we're going to be back here again in 20 or 30 years' time. So the goal, according to these radical Republicans, is to put former Confederate leaders on trial for treason. The goal should be to transform the South from an agrarian economy into an industrial one. And also the goal should be for the Union Army to ensure that African Americans continue to have rights and legal protections, which means, by the way, the armed occupation of the South. And remember that Johnson and radical Republicans butt heads over this. And the political division of them between them grows and grows until there's an impeachment crisis over this point. Now, remember that theoretically the impeachment doesn't, it revolves over Johnson violating what's called the Tenure of Office Act. But that's almost unimportant. The important thing is that there's this real deep division between Johnson and Republican radicals over the future of the country. And the division gets so bad that Republican radicals basically use the first opportunity that they have to accuse Johnson of violating the Constitution. Now, Johnson isn't successfully convicted in this impeachment trial, but it means that his political influence is so damaged because of impeachment that Congress actually supervises Reconstruction from roughly 1866 until 1877. And this is a period called Congressional Reconstruction, and it's very different from presidential Reconstruction. Congressional Reconstruction involves dividing the South into military districts and having the Union Army basically supervise those districts, and also, by the way, protect freed blacks in those districts. So the other problem here, though, is that even though fighting has ceased in the Civil War, that just means that we don't see very many battles. There are still tons of riots and small-scale uprisings, and you also have this underground movement of white supremacist groups that are using violence against African Americans and Northerners who have relocated into the South to prevent them from voting. So that also forces or motivates newly elected President Ulysses S. Grant in 1868 to once again suspend habeas corpus and basically declare martial law in the South, which temporarily sort of destroys and drives further underground white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. You should also be familiar with the Reconstruction Acts proposed by Congress. Basically, what these acts demanded is that armed occupation of the South would continue until the southern states agree to ratify the 13th, 14th, and eventually 15th Amendment. Remember, these amendments work in tandem. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment grants newly freed slaves the status of citizens, and the 15th Amendment grants all citizens the right to vote. Now, remember, there's also this dispute as to whether or not that applies to women, because women are citizens as well, even using the very crude legal standards of that time period. But eventually, the Supreme Court basically rules that that the 15th Amendment doesn't apply to women, much to the chagrin and annoyance of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Dorothea Dix, and other suffragettes who actually repudiate the 15th Amendment for not including women. So, what that means is that it will require the 19th Amendment in the future to fix that problem. So remember, after the passage of all of these amendments, and after these amendments are actually enforced and defended with the Union Army's occupation of the South, we see this very interesting and stunning change in the South, where seats that were held by former Confederate political leaders like Jefferson Davis are claimed by newly freed African-American politicians like Hiram Revels. In fact, the South, which has voted solidly for Democratic Party candidates since the days of Andrew Jackson and Democratic Republican candidates since the birth of the two-party system, suddenly it begins voting for Republican Party candidates. And that's because many former Confederates cannot themselves vote until they sign a loyalty pledge, and also because of the fact that African-American voting rights are being protected by the Union Army. But things begin to change. In the early 1870s, the Republican Party nationwide becomes embroiled in a series of corruption scandals. Also, what happens is that in the year 1873, the economy actually collapses. There is an economic panic, the Panic of 1873, and kind of the rule of thumb is that anytime you have an economic panic, you always blame whatever government or leader is in charge, regardless of whether or not they have very much to do with with it. So that kind of erodes confidence in the Republican Party. And so by 1876, the Democratic Party looks very, very competitive on a national level. And remember, that in itself is very stunning because the Democratic Party was still sort of broadly associated as being the party of secession during this time period. So the party itself is able to rehabilitate itself very, very quickly. Now, in 1876, you have two candidates running for president. The Republicans run Rutherford B. Hayes. The Democrats run a New Yorker by the name of Samuel Tilden. And what happens is you have a very close election in which both sides claim victory. Now, let's just say that if there is any election in which you can sort of make the case for widespread fraud, it's the election of 1876. So what happens is that because both sides declare victory, there is a congressional investigation that's conducted into the election. And what really happens, though, is that this panel is composed of a near even split between Republicans and Democrats. There's one extra Republican there. And what this panel agrees is that the Republicans will win the election of 1876. Rutherford Hayes becomes president, but Democrats will win, let's say, a more substantial longer-term advantage. Democrats will be able to secure home rule in the South without Union Army occupation. So as soon as that happens in this, what's called the Compromise of 1877, is that Southern states are basically left to kind of run their own affairs without the oversight of the Union Army. And what we also see is around the same time period is the passage of Jim Crow laws. These are laws that basically try to exclude African Americans from white society. You can kind of think of them as almost apartheid laws, where you have separate worlds, separate existences for African Americans and whites. And also, you have a series of laws and policies put into place that make it practically impossible for African Americans to vote. And those who are able to vote are very frequently harassed by white supremacist groups without, let's say, any action on the part of local authorities to do anything about it. So what happens is that the South, which had a brief time period where it was voting for Republican Party candidates, swings back to the Democratic Party. And, of course, then the question is, well, surely African Americans enjoy other protections, most notably legal protections. You don't just need politicians who agree with you for protection. That's what we have laws for, which is correct, because now we have 3 extra amendments, Amendments 13 through 15, that should provide African Americans with some basic legal protections. I mean, that's what the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment are all about, right? Protecting the rights of citizens. And by the way, granting citizenship rights for natural-born Americans, Americans who are basically born on U.S. soil. Well, what eventually happens is that issue goes to the Supreme Court in the court case Plessy versus Ferguson in the year 1896. And remember, what happens is that what the Supreme Court rules is that the 14th Amendment doesn't necessarily prevent local governments from offering separate facilities, separate schools, separate textbooks, separate community centers for African Americans, so long as those schools, those textbooks, those buses and streets and neighborhoods are equal with white facilities. Now, the reality is that that was almost never the case. But the court case Plessy versus Ferguson creates the precedent that separate is legal so long as separate is equal. So it actually takes another half century for the Supreme Court to reverse that ruling in Brown versus Board. But not only does that actually provide legal sanction for states basically discriminating by race in the South. It also provides legal protection for states beyond the South to discriminate against African Americans. And actually, this is one of the the tragic consequences of Plessy versus Ferguson, that Jim Crow laws begin in the South, but they don't stay in the South, and they begin migrating into states beyond the South. So what this kind of means is that after Plessy versus Ferguson, we sort of push the pause button, and we don't come back to the legacy of the Civil War until the 1950s and 60s and the Civil Rights era. So what we can kind of say is, after Reconstruction, that slavery is truly dead, that chattel slavery as a legal institution is destroyed, but the push factors that led to the establishment of chattel slavery in the first place don't go away. You still have the planter class, and the planter class is just as powerful and influential as ever. You also have the fact that the South is still reliant on the cash crop economy, that cotton, to a certain extent, is still king in the South and will stay king in the South well into the early 20th century. And even though slavery has been replaced with this system of cash crop agriculture and tenant farming, the fact is that the difference is one of degree as opposed to kind between cash crop farming and slavery. The fact is that African Americans in the South who were tenant farmers still had nowhere near the same number of rights as whites who did similar work. So we'll push the pause button for now, and we'll revisit the legacy of Reconstruction in the 1950s. But that's the overview of Reconstruction. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's tragic. Let's say the different approaches and the different sort of perspectives on Reconstruction. And again, I guarantee on your midterm, you will have to write about Reconstruction in some capacity. So, thanks, guys.